At 58, Evelyn Carter believed the only thing keeping her late husband's corn farm alive was discipline. Every dollar mattered, every acre had to earn its keep, and every mistake came with a price. So when she discovered that $27 was missing after a routine corn sale, she made a decision that stunned everyone. She fired her own son and ordered him to leave the family farm before sunset. The neighbors whispered that she had finally let grief turn into stubborn pride, while others laughed and said no harvest could survive after tearing a family apart like that. But just days later, as disaster crept across the cornfields, an old wooden box, a faded receipt for exactly $27, and a secret her husband had left behind revealed that nothing about that missing money was what it seemed, and the truth would change everything. But before we uncover what really happened, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it where you are right now? Whether you're starting your morning, winding down after work, or listening before bed. I hope you're having a wonderful day. If you enjoy heartfelt family stories filled with mystery, resilience, and unforgettable twists, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next story. Now, let's go back to the day $27 nearly destroyed a family. The first light of dawn spilled across the Carter family's corn farm, turning rows of green stalks into long ribbons of gold. Evelyn Carter stood beside the weathered barn with a clipboard tucked under one arm, already counting fertilizer bags before most of the county had finished breakfast. At 58, she carried herself with the quiet determination of someone who had learned that the land rewarded hard work but never offered sympathy. Since her husband Daniel had passed away 3 years earlier, every decision had rested on her shoulders. Rising costs, uncertain weather, and shrinking profits had turned each growing season into a gamble she could barely afford to lose. Even so, she refused to sell a single acre. Daniel had built this farm with his own hands, and keeping it alive had become her promise to him. Noah Carter climbed down from the combine, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cool morning air. At 27, he worked as hard as anyone in the county. But unlike his mother, he believed the farm had to change if it was going to survive. He carried a notebook filled with ideas about new planting methods, stronger seed varieties, and better soil management. Every time he mentioned them, Evelyn listened for a moment before reminding him that experience mattered more than theories. "We should test a different hybrid in the North Field next season," Noah said as he joined her near the grain shed. "The soil there is changing." "We could improve the yield." Evelyn checked another figure on her clipboard without looking up. "We've grown corn here the same way for decades. Times are different now. The land hasn't changed nearly as much as people think." Noah let out a quiet sigh. Arguments like this had become part of everyday life. Neither of them raised their voice anymore. The silence afterward always hurt more. By late morning, they loaded the final sacks of harvested corn from an early storage bin onto Ethan Brooks's truck. Ethan, owner of the local farm supply store, had bought grain from the Carters for years and knew both mother and son well enough to sense tension without asking questions. After weighing the load, he handed Evelyn the sales receipt before driving away toward town. Evelyn sat at the kitchen table after lunch, carefully matching receipts against the cash payment. Numbers had become her shield against uncertainty. If every dollar could be accounted for, perhaps everything else could stay under control too. Her eyes stopped on the total. She counted again, then a third time. $27 were missing. She searched the envelope once more before calling toward the back porch. "Noah!" He stepped inside, brushing dust from his jeans. "What's wrong?" Evelyn held up the receipt. "We're short $27. Noah looked at the paper, then quietly lowered his eyes. "I know." Her voice sharpened. You know? Yes. Where did it go? He hesitated just long enough for her worst fears to settle into place. I used it. For what? Noah remained silent. Evelyn waited, believing another sentence would come. None did. You took money from the farm without asking me? I'll make it right. That's not an answer. Noah looked toward the window instead of meeting her gaze. I can't explain right now. The words landed harder than any confession. Evelyn felt something deeper than anger. She felt betrayal. Every unpaid bill, every sleepless night, every sacrifice she had made since Daniel's death suddenly seemed to gather around those missing $27. This farm survives because we trust each other, she said. If that trust is gone, then I don't know what we're protecting anymore. Noah opened his mouth, but stopped himself. Whatever reason he carried stayed locked behind his silence. Evelyn straightened her shoulders, forcing herself to sound colder than she felt. You're done here. Noah stared at her. Mom, you heard me. You're finished working on this farm. The room became painfully still. If you can't respect this family enough to tell me the truth, then pack your things and leave before sunset. Noah searched her face for some sign that she might change her mind. There was none. Without another word, he walked upstairs. An hour later, he carried 2 bags to his pickup. Before climbing inside, he unlocked the old workshop where Daniel had kept his tools. From a dusty shelf, he carefully lifted a small wooden box, worn smooth by time, placed it on the passenger seat, and drove slowly down the gravel road as Evelyn watched from the porch, refusing to call him back. The truck disappeared beyond the rows of corn, leaving only drifting dust and one question she could not answer. Why had her son chosen silence over his own home? Noah drove until the familiar rows of corn disappeared behind rolling hills and small pastures. By evening, he reached the nearby town, where he rented a modest room above an old hardware store. The place held little more than a narrow bed, a desk, and a small window overlooking the main street. But it was affordable. He set the worn wooden box from his father's workshop on the desk and rested a hand on its lid without opening it. After a long silence, he unpacked only what he needed. Sleep came slowly. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard his mother's final words telling him to leave before sunset. Back at the Carter farm, Evelyn refused to let herself think about the empty bedroom upstairs. Before sunrise, she was already outside checking irrigation lines, feeding equipment, and reviewing the week's schedule. Tasks that Noah had always handled now became hers alone. She climbed into the tractor, hauled supplies across the fields, and inspected every section of the growing corn herself. By noon, fatigue settled into her shoulders, but she ignored it. She had promised herself she would prove the farm could continue without him, as she repaired a damaged fence beside the north field. Grace Miller walked over from the neighboring property carrying 2 cups of coffee. Grace had known the Carter family for decades and had watched Noah grow from an energetic boy into a hard-working farmer. She handed Evelyn one of the cups. "You've been out here since daylight." Evelyn accepted it with a quiet thank you. "There's plenty to do." Grace studied her friend's tired face. "And plenty you're trying not to think about." Evelyn looked back toward the corn instead of answering. Grace continued gently. "Daniel always said this farm mattered because of the family on it, not just the land." Evelyn's expression tightened. "Family also means honesty." Grace nodded. "It does. But sometimes silence has a reason. If Noah had a reason, he should have told me." Grace did not argue further. She simply squeezed Evelyn's shoulder before returning home, leaving the words hanging in the warm afternoon air. Later that day, Evelyn drove into town for replacement parts at Ethan Brooks's farm supply store. Ethan greeted her with the same friendly smile he had offered for years, though it faded when he noticed Noah was not with her. "Working alone today?" he asked. "From now on," Evelyn replied shortly. Ethan hesitated before retrieving the parts from a shelf. As he prepared the receipt, he seemed to remember something. "By the way, Noah stopped by here a few days ago." Evelyn looked up. "Did he—" "Yeah. Bought one small item. Cost him $27. Evelyn's grip tightened around the counter. "27?" Ethan nodded. "Funny amount to remember, but I only noticed because he paid the exact total in cash." "What did he buy?" Ethan scratched his chin. "I'm not sure it would mean much without seeing it. Just something he said he wanted to try." Evelyn waited for more, but Ethan simply shrugged. He seemed excited about it. She thanked him, paid for her supplies, and walked outside with more questions than answers. If Noah had spent the missing money here, why hadn't he simply said so? Pride quickly answered for her. Even if he had bought something for the farm, he still should have asked first. She loaded the supplies into her truck and drove home, repeating that thought until it almost sounded convincing. That evening, she balanced the farm accounts again at the kitchen table. The missing $27 still stood out like a stain across the ledger. She closed the notebook and looked through the window toward the empty machine shed where Noah's pickup usually sat. The silence across the farm felt heavier than it had the night before. In town, Noah found temporary work helping another farmer repair harvesting equipment. The hours were long, but they kept his mind occupied. When the day's work ended, he returned to his rented room and looked once more at the wooden box. He still did not open it. Instead, he folded the receipt in his pocket and slipped it carefully inside the box before closing the lid again. The next morning, dark clouds stretched across the western horizon. At the local diner, conversations shifted from crop prices to weather forecasts. Farmers studied their phones with growing concern. By afternoon, every local station carried the same report. A powerful storm system was forming, faster than expected, and could reach the county within days, bringing destructive winds and heavy rain directly toward the Carter farm. The storm warning lingered over the county, but the rain had not yet arrived. Noah spent his mornings repairing machinery at the neighboring farm where he had found temporary work. The owner appreciated his steady hands and practical ideas, and before long Noah was trusted with jobs that required careful judgment instead of simple labor. Even while tightening bolts or replacing worn belts, his thoughts drifted back to the Carter farm. He wondered whether his mother had remembered to inspect the drainage ditch near the north field or reinforce the storage doors before the weather turned. More than once he reached for his phone, only to stop himself. Every conversation he imagined ended with the same painful silence that had driven him away. At the end of each workday, he returned to the rented room above the hardware store. The old wooden box remained on the desk untouched except for the folded receipt he had placed inside. It reminded him of his father and of promises that suddenly felt impossible to keep. Across the county, Evelyn rose before daylight as always, determined not to let exhaustion slow her down. She checked irrigation pumps, inspected equipment, and walked nearly every row of corn herself because there was no one else to share the work. By the third morning, her knees ached from climbing in and out of machinery, and her shoulders burned from lifting supplies Noah would once have carried without being asked. Still, she refused Grace's offers of help. Pride had become almost as heavy as the work itself. While examining the north field, Evelyn noticed several leaves marked with tiny holes and pale streaks that had not been there days before. She knelt and turned one leaf over. A few small insects clung to the underside. She frowned. There had always been pests during the season, but these looked unfamiliar. She collected a few damaged leaves and continued farther into the field. The farther she walked, the more she found. Some stalks had begun to lose their healthy color, and a narrow strip near the edge of the field seemed weaker than the rest. "Not now," she whispered to herself. "Please, not now." That afternoon, she drove into town carrying the damaged leaves in a paper bag. Ethan Brooks examined them under the bright light of his shop. "Hard to be certain without testing," he admitted, "but you should keep an eye on them. If this spreads, don't wait too long to act." "Have you seen it around here before?" Evelyn asked. "A little farther west, maybe. Nothing major yet." His cautious tone offered little comfort. She thanked him and returned home, her mind racing through costs she could barely afford. Treating the fields would mean spending money she had hoped to save for the harvest. Ignoring the problem could cost far more. That evening, Grace stopped by with a basket of homemade bread. She found Evelyn sitting on the porch studying the fields instead of eating supper. "You look worried," Grace said. Evelyn handed her one of the damaged leaves. Grace examined it quietly. "Daniel hated surprises in the fields," she said after a moment. "Whenever something unusual appeared, he'd ask Noah to help figure it out." Evelyn managed a faint smile despite herself. Noah was always following him around. Grace laughed softly. "Not just following, asking questions every 5 minutes." The memory warmed them both for an instant. Grace continued. "Daniel once told me Noah noticed details other people missed." Evelyn looked toward the fading horizon. "He also learned to keep secrets." Grace understood the pain beneath the words. Maybe he learned to wait until people were ready to listen before leaving. Grace gently suggested searching Daniel's old workshop. He wrote everything down. If he ever dealt with something similar, he probably kept notes. After Grace left, Evelyn hesitated outside the workshop door. She had entered the building only when necessary since Daniel's death. His tools still hung where he had left them, and the scent of old wood and machine oil had never completely faded. Dust covered the workbench, but several shelves remained neatly organized. She searched through drawers filled with receipts, seed catalogs, and maintenance records before finding a stack of weathered notebooks tied together with faded twine. Most contained planting schedules and equipment repairs, but one held loose pages tucked between its covers. Several entries described conversations with Noah about improving soil health and testing stronger seed varieties in changing conditions. Daniel had written, "He sees things differently than I do. That's not weakness. Someday Evelyn will need to trust his instincts, even if they challenge ours." Evelyn read the sentence twice before quietly closing the notebook. She slipped the loose pages into her apron pocket without fully understanding why. Outside, the wind strengthened, carrying cooler air across the fields. The following morning, she returned to the north field and immediately saw the damage had spread. More leaves showed pale streaks, and a section of young corn near the fence had begun to wilt despite adequate moisture. She walked deeper into the rows, stopping as the unhealthy patch stretched farther than it had the day before. Standing alone among the silent stalks, Evelyn realized the problem was no longer isolated. Something was moving through the field faster than she had feared, and for the first time since Noah left, she wished he were standing beside her. The weak section in the north field weighed on Evelyn's mind through the night. Before sunrise, she carried Daniel's notebook back to the kitchen table, poured herself a cup of coffee, and began reading from the first page instead of skipping through scattered entries. His handwriting was neat and patient, recording rainfall totals, planting dates, repairs, and observations that stretched back years. Between the practical notes were occasional reflections she had almost forgotten he liked to write. One entry described how every season demanded different answers because the land was always changing, even when it appeared the same. Another praised Noah for noticing subtle differences in soil moisture that no one else had seen. Evelyn paused at that line. She remembered laughing when Daniel spent an entire afternoon listening to Noah explain why one corner of the field dried faster than the rest. Daniel had listened seriously. She had dismissed it as youthful enthusiasm. The memory no longer felt amusing. She continued reading until another passage caught her attention. Daniel had written, "If Noah keeps studying, he'll bring ideas this farm will need one day. My job isn't to make him farm exactly like me. It's to help him become better than me." Evelyn slowly closed the notebook. She wanted to disagree with the words, yet she could still hear Daniel's calm voice speaking them. For the first time since Noah left, she wondered whether she had spent too much energy protecting the past instead of preparing for the future. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of wind pushing against the porch screen. Dark clouds gathered farther west than they had the previous evening. The weather forecast had not improved. She tucked the notebook into a kitchen drawer and headed outside. The damaged patch in the north field had widened again. Several stalks leaned weakly, their leaves marked with the same pale streaks. Evelyn carefully inspected them, removing a few insects she found beneath the leaves and sealing them inside a small glass jar. She made another trip into town, hoping Ethan might recognize the signs more clearly. Ethan examined both the insects and the leaves under a magnifying lamp. "I'm still not comfortable guessing," he admitted. "But if I were you, I'd move quickly. Healthy plants can recover better than stressed ones." Evelyn nodded. "I'm trying to stay ahead of it." Ethan disappeared into the storage room to search through inventory records. When he returned, he carried a thin folder and frowned thoughtfully. "You asked the other day about Noah." Evelyn looked up without speaking. "I remembered what he bought." He opened the folder and pointed to an old sales slip. It wasn't fertilizer or chemicals. He ordered a small trial package of disease-resistant hybrid seed. Cost exactly $27. Evelyn stared at the paper. "Hybrid seed?" "Just a sample quantity. Farmers sometimes test them before buying enough for an entire field." "Did he tell you why he wanted it?" Ethan shook his head. "Only that he wanted to compare results himself." Evelyn folded her arms. "He never mentioned any of this to me." Ethan answered carefully, "I figured he had." She thanked him, took the copy of the sales slip he offered, and walked slowly back to her truck. The receipt explained where the money had gone, but it did not answer the question that mattered most. Why had Noah refused to tell her? Even during their argument, he could have ended everything with a single sentence. Instead, he had accepted being accused of taking farm money for himself. The silence still made no sense. On the drive home, she found herself remembering dozens of conversations she had cut short whenever Noah suggested trying something new. Perhaps he had stopped explaining because he no longer believed she would listen. The thought unsettled her more than she cared to admit. That evening, Grace visited again after noticing the truck in the driveway. Evelyn handed her the copied receipt without saying a word. Grace read it, then looked back at her friend. "So the $27 paid for seed?" "Apparently. Does that change anything?" Evelyn hesitated. "It changes part of the story." Grace returned the paper. "Not all of it." They sat together on the porch, watching the wind ripple through the corn. "Daniel always believed trust worked both ways," Grace said quietly. "Parents ask for honesty, but children also need to believe they'll be heard." Evelyn lowered her eyes. "I still don't understand why Noah kept quiet. Maybe he thought actions would speak louder than words." Before Evelyn could answer, a low rumble of thunder echoed across the fields. The breeze became a steady wind, bending the tops of the corn in long, rolling waves. Grace stood and looked toward the darkening western sky. "You should secure everything you can." Evelyn nodded and hurried toward the equipment shed. She fastened loose doors, covered machinery, and checked the grain bins one last time as the first heavy drops of rain struck the dusty ground. Within minutes, the wind strengthened into fierce gusts that whipped through the fields, flattening weeds and rattling every window of the farmhouse. Standing beneath the barn roof, Evelyn watched the first edge of the storm sweep across the land Daniel had loved and Noah had fought to protect in his own way, wondering how much of the crop would still be standing when morning came. The storm raged through the night, shaking the farmhouse with bursts of wind that rattled every window. Evelyn barely slept. Each loud crack outside made her imagine another section of corn folding beneath the weight of the rain. Before dawn, the worst of the storm finally moved east, leaving behind a heavy silence broken only by dripping water from the barn roof. She pulled on her boots, grabbed her raincoat, and hurried toward the fields. The sight stopped her after only a few steps. Large sections of corn lay bent in uneven waves where the strongest gusts had passed. Water filled low spots between the rows, and broken stalks were scattered across the ground. The damaged area in the north field looked even worse than she had feared. Some plants remained standing, but many leaned sharply, their weakened leaves torn by the wind. Evelyn walked slowly through the mud, lifting stalks where she could, knowing many would never recover. Every ruined row represented weeks of work and money she no longer had. She spent the morning clearing drainage channels with a shovel, hoping to move standing water away from the roots before more damage set in. Normally, Noah would have worked beside her without being asked. Together, they could have finished before noon. Alone, she was still digging when the afternoon sun briefly pushed through the clouds. By then, her hands ached, and exhaustion showed in every movement. Grace arrived carrying sandwiches and a thermos of coffee. She quietly took a second shovel and began helping without waiting for permission. For a while, neither woman spoke. Finally, Grace broke the silence. "You can't keep doing this alone." Evelyn wiped mud from her gloves. "I don't have much choice." "There's always a choice." Evelyn looked across the damaged field. "Not one that changes what's already happened." Grace rested on the shovel handle. "No. But some choices can change what happens next." Evelyn knew exactly what she meant, but answered only with a tired shake of her head. Pride still stood between her and the phone call she wanted to make. Across town, Noah finished repairing a grain conveyor at the farm where he had been working. During lunch, the owner switched on a local radio station. The weather report described heavy storm damage across the county, mentioning several corn farms that had suffered severe losses. Noah immediately thought of home. He tried to focus on his work, but every passing hour became harder to ignore. By late afternoon, he drove past a hill overlooking the Carter property. From that distance, he could see flattened sections of corn stretching across parts of the fields. His hands tightened around the steering wheel. He wanted to drive the rest of the way, step out of the truck, and start helping without saying a word. Instead, he remained parked on the roadside for several minutes before turning back toward town. His mother had ordered him to leave. He could not force his way back onto the farm she had told him was no longer his place. That evening, Grace stopped by the rented room above the hardware store. Noah looked surprised to see her standing at the door. "How bad is it?" he asked before she could speak. Grace sighed. "Bad enough that Evelyn hasn't stopped working since daylight." Noah lowered his eyes. "Is she all right?" "She's exhausted." Grace stepped inside. "She won't admit she needs help." Noah looked toward the wooden box resting on the desk. "She made her decision. And you're letting that be the end?" He remained silent. Grace studied him carefully. "You still care about that farm?" "Of course I do. Then why stay away?" Noah answered honestly. "Because if I come back before she's ready, she'll think I'm ignoring everything she said. I don't want another fight." Grace nodded slowly. Sometimes people need time before they can hear what matters. She noticed the worry on his face and added, "But time doesn't always wait for us." After she left, Noah sat beside the window watching dark clouds gather once again along the western horizon. The weather forecast had warned that the first storm would not be the last. He reached for the wooden box, rested his hand on it, then pulled out a county weather bulletin from the table instead. The report confirmed his fears. A second storm system, stronger than the first, was expected to arrive within a few days, bringing heavier rain and even more destructive winds. Noah folded the paper carefully. Knowing the damaged fields at home might not survive another direct hit, the forecast of a second storm spread quickly through the county. Farmers hurried to reinforce grain bins, clear drainage ditches, and salvage whatever they could before the next wave of rain arrived. Evelyn worked from sunrise until darkness, but every completed task revealed two more waiting. The damaged corn demanded attention, machinery needed repairs, and the weakened sections of fencing had to be secured. By the third day after the first storm, fatigue slowed even her determined pace. She dropped a wrench while repairing an irrigation valve and simply stood still for a moment, realizing her hands were trembling. Grace, watching from the driveway, walked over without saying a word. "You need help," she said gently. Evelyn wiped her hands on an old towel. "I don't have anyone else." Grace met her eyes. "You do, whether you admit it or not." Evelyn looked toward the fields. "I told him to leave. You also raised a son who still loves this place." Those words lingered long after Grace returned home. Late that afternoon, the familiar sound of a pickup truck rolled slowly down the gravel road. Evelyn looked up from the machine shed and saw Noah step out. He remained beside the truck instead of walking toward the house. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Noah broke the silence. "Grace told me about the storm." Evelyn nodded once. "You didn't have to come." "I know." He glanced across the fields. "But I couldn't stay away." She folded her arms, unsure whether to feel relieved or defensive. "I'm not asking you to move back. I'm not asking to—" His answer carried no bitterness, only quiet honesty. "I just want to help save the crop." Evelyn hesitated. Pride urged her to refuse. One look across the damaged fields reminded her she no longer had that luxury. "Fine," she said softly. "The work starts now." Noah simply nodded and walked toward the equipment shed, as though he had never left. The afternoon passed with few words. Noah inspected drainage channels first, reopening several that had become blocked by debris after the storm. He adjusted irrigation controls to prevent water from collecting around weakened roots and repaired a damaged section of pipe that Evelyn had struggled to reach alone. They worked side by side, speaking only when necessary. "Hand me the wrench. The shovel's behind the trailer. That gate needs another chain." The silence felt awkward but no longer hostile. As evening approached, Noah walked into the north field carrying a notebook from his truck. He carefully examined the damaged rows, kneeling beside several patches where the corn had survived despite heavy wind. He compared the leaves, checked the soil beneath them, and studied the direction in which the stalks had fallen. Evelyn watched from several rows away. "What are you looking for?" she asked. Noah stood and brushed dirt from his hands. "Patterns." "Patterns?" "The damaged plants aren't all failing for the same reason." She frowned but listened. Noah pointed toward one narrow strip near the edge of the field. "Look at these." Evelyn stepped closer. The stalks there stood straighter than most surrounding plants. Their leaves showed far fewer pale streaks, and although the ground remained wet, the roots appeared stronger. "Why are these different?" she asked. Noah remained focused on the plants. "That's what I'm trying to confirm." He carefully examined several more rows before speaking again. "If I'm right, we still have a chance." Evelyn looked at him with cautious hope. A chance for what? To stop losing the rest of the field. She wanted to ask more questions, but years of disagreement held her back. Instead, she waited. Noah looked across the rows once more. It won't work unless we move quickly. Then tell me what needs to be done. He hesitated. Not yet. Evelyn's shoulders stiffened. Not yet. I need to be certain before we risk the healthy sections. She heard echoes of their last argument in those words and felt frustration rising again. Noah noticed her expression and quietly added, I'm not hiding anything from you. I just don't want to guess. The explanation eased the tension, though not completely. Together they finished securing loose equipment before sunset. As they walked back toward the barn, thunder rumbled faintly in the distance once more. Noah looked toward the dark western horizon, then back at the surviving strip of corn. I know what might save this harvest, he said at last. But it only works if you trust me enough to let me do it. Evelyn stood quietly beside the barn after Noah's words settled into the evening air. Trust him. The request sounded simple, yet it reached far beyond the damaged fields around them. For years, she had trusted routines, records, and experience. Trusting ideas she did not fully understand had always felt like taking unnecessary risks. Now the farm stood in greater danger than at any point since Daniel's death, and the familiar methods were no longer enough. She looked toward the battered rows of corn, then back at her son. Show me, she said at last. Noah gave a small nod. Early the next morning, they returned to the north field, carrying tools, notebooks, and marking flags. Noah walked directly to the narrow strip of healthier corn he had examined the previous evening. He pointed to the stronger stalks. These plants are handling both the disease and the storm better than the rest. Evelyn carefully studied them. The difference was subtle, but real. Their leaves remained greener, their roots held more firmly in the wet soil, and fewer insects clung beneath the leaves. What makes them different? She asked. Noah crouched beside one row. The soil drains a little better here, but that's only part of it. He gently brushed away dirt near the base of one plant. These are the same type of plants I wanted to compare before everything happened. Evelyn remembered Ethan's receipt for the trial seed, but said nothing. Noah continued. I noticed signs that the old variety might struggle if the weather turned bad. I wanted proof before asking you to replace part of next year's crop. He paused. I should have explained it anyway. Evelyn took a slow breath. And I should have listened. It was not a complete apology, but it was the closest either of them had come since he returned. They spent the morning following Noah's plan. He directed water away from the healthier rows, removed badly infected plants that threatened nearby sections, and reorganized the order in which they inspected the field. The work was exhausting, but it had purpose. Evelyn noticed that Noah never rushed. Every decision came after careful observation, much like Daniel had always done. Around midday, Grace arrived with sandwiches and watched them working together. She smiled without interrupting. Looks like you've become a team again, she said. Evelyn glanced toward Noah before answering. We're trying. Grace handed Noah a bottle of water. Your father would have liked seeing this. Noah smiled faintly. He always believed problems were easier to solve than arguments. Grace laughed softly. That's because he usually left the arguing to the two of you. For the first time in days, Evelyn laughed as well. The sound surprised even her. As they rested beneath the shade of the old oak tree, Noah looked across the fields. Dad used to bring me here after planting season, he said quietly. He'd ask me what I noticed first. Evelyn smiled at the memory. You always answer differently, because he never wanted the same answer twice. Noah looked down at the dirt beneath his boots. He said farming wasn't about repeating yesterday. It was about understanding today. Evelyn remembered those afternoons more clearly now. Daniel would patiently listen while Noah pointed out changes in the soil, insect activity, or the shape of clouds. She had often teased them for turning simple walks into long lessons. Now those lessons seemed far more valuable than she had realized. The afternoon brought encouraging signs. After redirecting water and removing damaged plants, the healthier strip continued to stand firm, while nearby sections showed fewer new signs of stress. The improvement was modest, but enough to restore a little hope. Evelyn watched Noah make careful notes in his notebook. "You really believed this could work," she said. "I believed it deserved a chance." She nodded slowly. "So did your father." Their eyes met for a brief moment without anger or blame. The distance between them had not disappeared, but it had begun to narrow. As evening approached, they walked farther into the southern field to inspect the remaining crop. The stronger plants gave them confidence, yet the wider view quickly reminded them of reality. Large stretches of corn still leaned heavily from the first storm, weakened by disease and soaked ground. Another powerful system was expected within days. Noah quietly calculated how much could still be saved if the weather held long enough. Evelyn followed his gaze across the fields that had supported their family for generations. "We've made progress," she said. Noah nodded, though his expression remained serious. "Yes, but it isn't enough." He looked toward the dark clouds beginning to gather once more along the western horizon. "If the next storm arrives before we're ready," he said softly, "most of the farm may still be lost." Morning arrived beneath a gray sky that never fully brightened. The air felt heavy, carrying the quiet promise of another storm. Evelyn and Noah returned to the fields before breakfast, continuing the work they had started together. They cleared more damaged plants, reinforced drainage channels, and checked the healthier strip that had become their greatest source of hope. It was still standing strong. The difference between those rows and the rest of the field was impossible to ignore now. Even Evelyn could see that Noah's careful observations had given them something worth protecting. As they finished for the morning, Noah left to collect additional supplies from the equipment shed, while Evelyn returned to the farmhouse to review the farm records. She wanted to estimate how much of the harvest they might still save if the weather gave them enough time. Opening the kitchen drawer, she found Daniel's notebook beneath a stack of receipts. Beside it lay the copy of Ethan's sales slip showing the $27 purchase. She unfolded it again, studying the faded print more carefully than before. A second piece of paper slipped from between the notebook's pages and landed on the table. It was another receipt, dated the same day, confirming the order had been delivered directly to the Carter farm. Attached to it was a small handwritten note in Noah's familiar handwriting. "Trial seed for North Field. If it performs well, maybe Mom will believe the results instead of my words." Evelyn read the sentence twice before lowering the paper. There had never been any personal purchase. Noah had spent the money entirely on the farm. She closed her eyes, remembering the anger in her own voice as she accused him of taking what did not belong to him. He had accepted the accusation without defending himself, not because he was guilty, but because he had wanted the field to prove his idea first. The realization settled heavily on her heart. A knock at the screen door interrupted her thoughts. Grace stepped inside, carrying a weather bulletin folded beneath her arm. One look at Evelyn's face told her something had changed. Evelyn silently handed her both receipts and Noah's note. Grace read them carefully before placing them back on the table. "Now you know," she said softly. Evelyn nodded, unable to speak for a moment. "I blamed him for stealing from the farm." Her voice barely rose above a whisper. "He was trying to protect it." Grace rested a gentle hand on her shoulder. "We all make mistakes." Evelyn shook her head. "Not like this." Grace reached into the basket she had carried and removed an old envelope sealed years earlier. Daniel asked me to keep this until the right time. I never knew exactly when that would be. She handed it to Evelyn. Across the front, in Daniel's careful handwriting, were only a few words. For Evelyn, when trusting becomes harder than working. Evelyn carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a short letter, yellowed with age but still clear. Daniel wrote that farming had taught him every season required courage. Yet the greatest risk was refusing to let the next generation grow into its own strengths. He admitted that Noah would challenge old habits because he loved the farm just as deeply as they did. Near the end, he added, "If the day comes when you must choose between holding tightly to the past or trusting Noah to build the future, choose trust. The land can recover from storms. Families recover only when someone decides to listen." Tears filled Evelyn's eyes before she reached the final line. She folded the letter carefully and held it against her chest. Grace remained beside her in respectful silence. "He understood us better than we understood ourselves," Evelyn finally said. Grace smiled sadly. "Daniel usually did." Outside, Noah finished loading tools onto the trailer, unaware of the letter waiting inside the farmhouse, when Evelyn stepped onto the porch. She looked at him with new understanding, though the words she wanted to say refused to come. Instead, she walked across the yard and quietly handed him a bottle of water before returning to work beside him. Noah noticed the kindness in the simple gesture but asked no questions. There would be time later, he hoped. For now, the fields still needed them. Throughout the afternoon, they strengthened the healthiest sections as dark clouds slowly gathered once again along the western horizon. The wind grew stronger with every passing hour, bending the tops of the corn into restless waves. Shortly before sunset, Noah checked the latest weather report on his phone. His expression turned serious. He handed it to Evelyn without speaking. The updated forecast confirmed their greatest fear. The final storm system had accelerated and would reach the county before the next day's harvest could begin, bringing powerful winds and torrential rain directly across the Carter farm. Before dawn, the Carter farm was already awake. Heavy clouds covered the sky, and the air carried the damp stillness that always came before severe weather. Noah stood beside the equipment shed with a notebook in one hand and a map of the fields spread across the hood of his truck. He had spent half the night studying the healthiest sections of corn and planning the fastest way to protect as much of the harvest as possible. Evelyn joined him, fastening her work gloves. "Where do we start?" she asked. Noah pointed to the narrow strip in the north field. "Everything starts there. Those plants held through the first storm. If we protect them, we can use them to guide the rest of the harvest." Evelyn nodded without hesitation. "Then that's what we'll do." Word of the approaching storm spread quickly across neighboring farms. Before sunrise, Grace arrived with two of her relatives. Ethan drove in with extra fuel, replacement parts, and supplies from his store. A few neighboring farmers followed with tractors and wagons after hearing the Carter farm needed help. No one asked for payment. Daniel had helped many of them over the years, and now they had come to return the favor. Noah thanked them briefly before assigning jobs. "Keep the drainage channels open. Harvest the strongest rows first. Leave the damaged sections until last. If the wind comes early, move everything straight to the storage bins." His calm confidence surprised several people, including Evelyn. She watched the group immediately begin working, realizing they trusted Noah's judgment without question. The morning became a race against time. Combines moved carefully through the healthiest rows, while others cleared fallen stalks that blocked equipment. Noah constantly crossed the fields, checking moisture levels and redirecting workers wherever conditions changed. The stronger strip of corn he had protected earlier became the center of every decision. Those plants remained upright despite saturated soil, allowing the harvesting equipment to continue moving when other areas became too unstable. Evelyn worked beside the volunteers, loading wagons, clearing debris and helping wherever she was needed. Several times she caught herself looking toward Noah. Instead of seeing the young man she had once believed too inexperienced, she saw someone making thoughtful decisions under enormous pressure, just as Daniel always had. Around midday, the first strong gusts swept across the fields. Leaves rustled loudly, and dark clouds lowered over the western horizon. "We're running out of time," Ethan called from his tractor. Noah glanced at the sky, then poured the healthier rows. "Finish this section first," he answered. "Don't split the equipment." The choice felt risky, but everyone followed his instructions. Within an hour, the decision proved right. The healthy strip produced enough stable grain to fill several wagons, while also providing the strongest plants for future seed selection. More importantly, harvesting that section first allowed machinery to avoid becoming trapped in the increasingly muddy ground farther south. The wind strengthened again. Rain began as scattered drops before turning into a steady shower. Workers hurried to move the final loads into storage while Noah directed traffic between wagons and grain bins. Evelyn climbed into one tractor despite the rain and drove another load across the yard. She no longer questioned Noah's plan. She simply trusted it. By late afternoon, the storm finally arrived in full force. Powerful winds bent the remaining damaged corn nearly flat, and rain swept across the fields in gray sheets. Everyone retreated toward the barns after securing the last wagon. From the doorway, they watched the unharvested sections struggle against the storm. Evelyn's heart sank as another portion of the weakened field gave way. Yet when the rain eased enough to inspect the results, they quickly realized something remarkable. The grain gathered from the protected sections had safely reached storage before the storm struck. The healthier rows Noah had identified had provided enough quality corn to preserve the season's most valuable yield, while their careful work prevented far greater losses across the rest of the farm. They had not saved every acre, but they had saved the harvest that mattered most. Grace smiled through the rain. Daniel would have been proud today. Evelyn looked at Noah, who stood quietly watching the fields rather than celebrating. She stepped beside him. "You saved this farm," she said softly. Noah shook his head. "We all did." As the volunteers began heading home, Evelyn returned to the farmhouse to gather dry towels and coffee for those still helping. While opening the drawer where she had kept Daniel's notebook, she noticed another folded page tucked deep inside its back cover, hidden behind several older records. She carefully pulled it free, recognizing Daniel's handwriting on the outside, and realized there was one more message from him she had never seen before. When the last of the volunteers left the Carter farm, the rain had softened into a gentle drizzle. The fields still bore the scars of the storms, but the grain bins stood full enough to carry the family through another season. Evelyn remained in the farmhouse, holding the folded page she had discovered inside Daniel's notebook. She carefully opened it and recognized his familiar handwriting immediately. The letter was shorter than the first one Grace had given her, but every sentence carried the same quiet wisdom that had guided their family for years. Daniel wrote that one day the farm would belong not to memories, but to the people willing to care for it. He reminded Evelyn that protecting the land did not mean protecting every old habit. Near the end, he added, "If Noah chooses a different path than we did, don't mistake difference for disrespect. The greatest harvest a parent can leave behind is confidence in a child who is ready to lead." Evelyn lowered the letter and wiped away tears she no longer tried to hide. For the first time since Daniel's passing, she felt as though he had spoken directly into the moment she needed him most. She folded the page carefully and slipped it back into the notebook before walking outside. Noah was standing near the repaired section of the north field, looking over the surviving rows of corn. The clouds had begun to break apart, allowing late afternoon sunlight to fall across the farm. Evelyn stopped beside him, For several moments, neither of them spoke. Finally, she broke the silence. "I owe you the truth before anything else." Noah turned toward her. "Mom," she gently raised a hand, "please let me finish." He nodded. Evelyn took a slow breath. "I accused you of taking from this farm when you were trying to protect it. I never asked enough questions. I never gave you the chance to explain. I let my fear speak louder than my trust." She looked down briefly before meeting his eyes again. "I'm sorry." Noah remained quiet for a moment. "I wasn't completely right either." Evelyn frowned slightly. "You shouldn't have had to defend yourself." "Maybe not," Noah answered. "But I should have told you what I was doing. I kept thinking that if the trial worked, the results would convince you better than another argument. Instead, my silence only made everything worse." Evelyn slowly nodded. "Then we both let silence make our decisions." The weight that had separated them for weeks finally began to lift. Without another word, Evelyn stepped forward and embraced her son. Neither of them hurried to let go. The apology did not erase the past, but it gave them a way to move beyond it. Later that week, several neighbors gathered outside the grain storage building to celebrate the successful harvest. Grace brought homemade pies. Ethan delivered supplies he had promised after the storm. And the volunteers who had helped save the crop stopped by to see the results. During the small gathering, Evelyn climbed onto the flatbed trailer where everyone could hear her. She looked first at the neighbors, then at Noah. "I want to thank every one of you," she began. "This farm is still standing because people chose kindness when they could have stayed home." She paused before continuing. "But there is something else I need to say." The yard grew quiet. Evelyn turned toward her son. "When $27 went missing, I believed the worst without listening. I sent Noah away from the farm his father loved and the farm he never stopped loving. I was wrong." Noah looked surprised as she continued. "He didn't take from this family. He invested in it. The ideas I doubted became the reason we saved this harvest." Several neighbors exchanged quiet smiles. Grace looked toward the sky as though silently thanking Daniel. Evelyn reached into her pocket and unfolded the receipt for the $27 purchase. Holding it up, she said, "Sometimes the smallest amount of money can reveal the greatest lesson. This receipt reminds me that trust is worth far more than $27. She handed the paper to Noah. "And so is the future." After the gathering ended, mother and son walked together toward the farmhouse. Evelyn carried Daniel's notebook beneath her arm. "I've been thinking," she said. "The farm shouldn't depend on one person anymore." Noah glanced at her. "What do you mean?" She smiled. "The North Field is yours to manage next season. You choose the seed, the planting plan, and the improvements. I'll still be here to help, but the decisions will be yours." Noah stopped walking. "Are you sure? Your father already answered that question years ago." She handed him the notebook. "Now I'm answering it too." Noah accepted it carefully, holding the weathered cover with the same respect Daniel once had. They spent the following weeks repairing fences, restoring drainage systems, and preparing the fields for the next planting season. This time they planned every step together. Evelyn still shared her experience, while Noah introduced new methods supported by careful observation rather than guesswork. Their conversations became discussions instead of arguments. The farm remained rooted in tradition, but it also welcomed change. On a crisp autumn evening, the last wagons of harvested corn rolled into storage beneath a clear, golden sky. Evelyn stood beside Noah at the edge of the North Field, where the strongest rows had first given them hope after the storms. She looked across the land that had carried 3 generations of the Carter family and smiled. The harvest they had saved was more than grain waiting in the bins. It was trust rebuilt, a promise kept, and a future finally shared.